getting into the formal part of this video or this conversation. Hi, Karen. Welcome to the Agile Insight series. I'm super happy to have you with us, especially as, if I'm not mistaken, it's 7 o'clock in the morning where you're based. Is that correct?
That's right. That's all good. Yes.
Yeah. So I think you have your strong coffee with you.
Yes, I do.
To make it through
ready.
the conversation. I will try to play my part as well so that nobody falls asleep, especially not you.
Yeah.
So Karen, most of our audience is familiar with me, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing myself, but I think they don't know you yet. So why don't you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And we are good friends, and it's nice to be part of this. So I appreciate the opportunity. My background is I'm an engineer. So, I mean, 35 years ago, I was a software engineer at Hewlett Packard, and I was there for 15 years. And over time, moved up sort of through the ranks and left HP and worked on my doctorate degree in organizational development and organizational psychology. So kind of an odd mix between an engineer and an OD person, but got the opportunity to be a CIO and a COO and a president of a financial company. So lots of experiences with lots of different industries, from nonprofit to aircraft to medical device to medical foods to nursing. So I've made a lot of mistakes, and I've also had some really good fortune of really good experiments. And so anyway, long story short, 35 years of corporate. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I left corporate America and started working on leadership development. And that's when I met Sohrab, and I also met Pete Behrens. And so those two are kind of instrumental in my journey of working with leadership and agile and agility. And now I coach executives and leaders, and I teach psychological safety. So that's what I've been doing for about the last 4 or 5 years, and I love it. So that's my story in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's your story in a nutshell. So I initially had written down for me to jump into the topic of psychological safety right away. But now that you gave an introduction about yourself, I take a few steps back. You started out as an engineer, and then you moved into organizational development and psychology. How did that happen? What triggered this very different path for you as an engineer back then?
Yeah, it's funny because at HP, Hewlett Packard, back in the day when I worked there, so I'll date myself, right, in the 80s, they were a massive company, 320,000 employees in 120 countries. My employee number was 291126. I still remember. But they made a big effort to really invest in their management and leadership. And so as I moved out of doing software development and those types of things, I moved into management, and they were great about supporting and helping you go back to college and school. So my master's degree I got through HP, and my doctorate degree through their encouragement, and mostly because they were really about, as you moved up in the company, it wasn't really about your technical skills. It was more about your ability to manage and coach and lead people. So lots of good encouragement from Hewlett Packard. And then just really kind of a fun fact, when I first started college, I wanted to be a psychologist. And I went to college on a basketball scholarship. And so I was going to school, and I was trying to take all these psychology classes. And the truth of the matter is, my advisor sort of said, this isn't going to be the sexiest career. Like, you're not going to have a job where people come into your office with this leather couch and like tell you your problems and you're going to fix it all. You're probably going to be working at Lutheran Social Services for minimum wage. So as a result, I stopped working on that and went into technology. But HP brought that back in me. So there you go. No one's ever asked me that question. And so that's what happened. That's a great.
Yeah, so that's question. Interesting. So your interest was there already from an early age, more or less, right? I mean, going into to university, you were probably 18, maybe 19 years old. So you wanted to do psychology, probably not organizational psychology and development, but then later during your leadership years, this became a topic. And now you mentioned HP, and sometimes I think people forget how important, not only massive in terms of size, but also important in terms of impact HP used to be, because that's the company that basically created Silicon Valley to some extent. And if I'm not mistaken, the HP way as a certain type of leadership and leading an organization had also a lot of impact on many decades of entrepreneurs to come. Now, if you think about that time back then, how did this HP way basically shape you going through the ranks and becoming a leader within the organization?
I am so impressed with you, Sohrab. Like, you know the story. Yeah. Bill and Dave. So, you know, we had Bill Packard, Dave Hewlett Packard, Dave. Anyway, I think I probably got their first names wrong. But they were amazing leaders. I have to be honest. Actually, it's Dave Packard, and he was born on September 7th, which is the same birthday that mine is. So I thought we were kindred spirits anyway. But your question about leadership, one of the most important things that I learned working at HP back in the early days was something called MBO, right? Management by Objectives. And it was a phenomenal way to lead people. It was really about give clear, like, here's what we're trying to accomplish, like what are the outcomes, and you know, that kind of thing. But it was much more about autonomy. So you learned how to lead through objectives that were related to the overall sort of company goals. And at that time, we were really big into Kaizen. And if you're familiar with the Japanese, you know, kind of slow, steady, continual progress. Yeah. And that was sort of the HP way. And yeah, I was super proud of working at Hewlett Packard. I bled blue. I'm not going to say I didn't for probably the first sort of 10 years of my time there. And sadly, things changed quite a bit. Yeah. And this is a hard thing for me to say, but when Carly Farina took over as the CEO, I can tell you that I was super proud because it was a woman leading a big technical company.
I think it was the first one, right?
Yeah. And the thing that happened is that she had such a different culture than what the original Hewlett Packard was. Mm-hmm. The original test and measurement part of HP was how audio oscillators and all of that. It's from the movie Fantasia, if anybody's ever heard of that. I mean, that was kind of the thing, right? Test and measurement, they hung their hat on that. And then as we progressed, we got into computers and laptops and mid-sized computers and the printer market and all that. That came later. But the point I guess I'm trying to make is that Carly's style was very, very different. And that was really hard for the culture of that company. It's certainly me. And I, as a female, you know, aspired to be a big executive in a large company like that. And I really looked up to her. But the truth of the matter is, it wasn't really about the gender. It was more about the culture and what she brought and how different that was than what the HP way was. So.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that entrepreneurship mindset and experimentation and all of that basically went down the road, and ultimately HP to some extent lost its way. But that's not going to be the major focus of our conversation today.
That's a total curveball, by the way. I had no idea you were going to. For everybody that's on the call, they're like, what are you guys doing? I'm like, I'm not sure what we're doing either. That's all good.
Now, what I find interesting is that people like Bill and Dave at HP, they had all of these leadership principles in place without the science backing things up, right? So they basically held a certain set of beliefs, and based on what they did, now a lot of the case studies have been created. What I want to now move into is the topic of psychological safety, which is something that is well researched. And I'm sure you will share with us who the most relevant researchers and thought leaders in that space are. But as a final thing related to HP, when you look back at your time at HP, starting out as an engineer, moving up the ranks, and looking at it from today's perspective, to what extent did you experience psychological safety back then? And then we'll move into this topic in a bit more detail.
Yeah. So psychological safety back in the 80s and 90s, I'll be honest, like HP was a great place to work, but I did learn in retrospective today, as I look back on my journey over the number of companies, I think I've worked for 10 different companies now over my 35-year career, most of it at HP. I was a female in a predominantly male discipline, if you will. I think it's still the case. Like I was a COBOL programmer and a Fortran programmer, and there wasn't a lot of females in that particular, job type. And I'll be honest, like I more than anything wanted to fit in. And when people would say to me things like, "You're not like the other females," I took it as a compliment because I wanted to be liked and I wanted to be included as an innate part of us as humans. Like we're pack animals, we want to feel like we're valued and that we fit in. Mm-hmm. So there was nothing by design that I was treated differently. But the thing, I guess, as a reflection back on that is really that created a situation for me where I wasn't necessarily authentically me. I behaved in a way that encouraged me to be like others so that I could feel accepted and valued. And so that, in retrospective now, when I talk about psychological safety, like that's not what we want. That's not the intent. That's not the hope, is that people show up and assimilate and try to fit in. The idea would be is that you're authentic and you're accepted for who you are, however you are. And as you continue to be included, then you begin to learn and people encourage you, and then you contribute and you get sort of earned the ability to contribute because that you've shown that you have the skill set. And then you're able to sort of challenge the status quo, which puts you in a place of like, hey, I see things different. And, what we've always done is maybe not the right thing to do. And I can't say that I did that in my career at Hewlett Packard, because I think the norms were typically, you sort of assimilated and you did what everybody else did. Yeah. So
either you fit in or you don't.
Yeah. And some of it is, I, as a female, again, I was a little different, right? I was different than probably predominantly most of the males in my particular job type. So they loved me because I was the female in the group, but I wanted to just fit in.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So you've already moved into a bit defining what psychological safety is, right? Being accepted for who you are, how you are, and based on that, then being able to make a contribution to what the team does, to what the organization does. Now, before we go into defining it a bit more, bringing it a bit more meat onto the bones, I'm interested now, what made you interested in this particular field of research? Because you went into organizational development and psychology, etc. There are a lot of things that one could focus on. But in the past years, as you and I spoke earlier, this has been your main point of interest. And you have also mentioned yourself, you've become more or less a coach, a teacher for this particular topic. What made this stand out to you among all the other topics that are out there to make teams and organizations more effective?
Yeah. Well, so I guess in looking back at my career, not only Hewlett Packard, but as a female, sort of I moved into CIO roles, COO roles, the president of a financial technology company. And when I moved away from that over the last 4 or 5 years and met you and Pete and those others, I had this ability to really reflect and look back at, like, you know, what was the core ingredient that made businesses really effective and productive? And it really wasn't about technology and globalization and all of that. In my head, that was sort of the baseline. Everybody had that. It really is about the people. And I know we've talked, you know, everybody knows that, everybody says that, but I was like, more than that, it was like, well, then what is it? What is it about the people? And some of it was just some really hard self-reflection on myself about, how did you show up at work, Karen? Mm-hmm. And I'll be transparent. I'm not super proud of always the way I showed up, because not only at Hewlett Packard did I sort of try to fit in, but as I became an executive through the ranks, again, there's not a lot of females at the C level in most companies, and even the board level. And the financial companies, I'll tell you, like the one that I was running as president, I absolutely was the only females in the room. And guess what I'm getting at here is that really, I didn't speak up a lot of times because there are things I wanted to maybe do different, but I didn't want to be that person in the room that was negative. Or as a female, I didn't want to be bossy and bitchy. And so I didn't always do the things that in my heart I felt were right. So I did what I think my brain thought, but my heart, my values, and my gut, my intuition were fighting with me. And so to answer your question, this part of business and this part of psychology and organizational development, this concept of what do you need to do to show up at work and feel valued and be that person that's able to go, guess what, I see it different, and not get into that triggered mode of fight, flight, or freeze, because I did that all the time. The fight would be I'd get defensive or negative in the meeting, and then I wasn't proud of my behavior, and then I might get labeled. Or freeze would be I'd say nothing because I didn't want a person to like be the person in the room that like was going against the grain, and so I would just be quiet, you know. Or flight would be the minute the meeting was over, I'd be in the hall talking to somebody else about what's happening in the meeting after the meeting, right? And none of these things, fight, flight, or freeze, in the business world are truly good, you know, or something that's going to help you be productive and run the company. And so sort of that's why, for me, it was more of this personal reflection on like, how did I show up and what could I do now at this point in my career to say, how can you make it better? How, not that I know it all, but how can I show up and share the things that I learned, and how can I help others learn a little bit more about what is this thing, psychological safety, and when I feel vulnerable, how can I be embraced instead of go into that fight, flight, or freeze mode like I'm being chased by a tiger or something.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So it came a lot out of your personal interest and also based on your own reflections, as you mentioned. Now, you have worked with, I think, probably not all, but safe to say some of the major thought leaders in that space, attended their courses, gone through their research, etc. How would you define psychological safety today in a few sentences? And then I'd like to explore with you what concrete steps leaders of teams and organizations can take in order to create the environment so that psychological safety can emerge. But let's take one question after the other, sorry.
Yeah, so you'll keep me on track. I think I got it. So first of all, what the thought leaders, I'll give credit to a lot of the folks that I've really studied now. So Timothy Clark, he's an Oxford researcher. He runs a company called Leader Factor. He has a book called The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, and I am a certified guide in his community. And so that thought leadership is truly instrumental. We can talk a little bit more about his framework, but Amy Edmondson, clearly, if folks know her, she's she's a leader in this space from the 90s and on, and she's a professor at the Harvard Business School today. She's also an author of The Fearless Organization, and I've gone through her work on something called the Fearless Organization Scan. She has a survey that she teaches coaches and consultants to do, and I've gone through that. It's called the PSI, which is the Psychological Safety Index, and it's 7 questions that she asks, but it's categorized into really 4 areas. And those are like speaking up, the ability to speak up, the ability to take risks, the ability to ask for help, and the ability to be inclusive. And so she categorizes those 7 questions into those 4 quadrants. And so she's phenomenal. You can Google her, she's everywhere. And she did a lot with research on NICUs, so in the hospitals for infants and some of that, what does it take to speak up to a surgeon, and how do you actually really as a group be able to do what's best for the baby, for the patient, and how does psychological safety play into that? So she's phenomenal. Anyway, moving on. Brene Brown, I've gone through her stuff, and so if you want to geek out on her, I can talk to you forever about vulnerability and shame are her things. And she's based out of Texas. And again, she's a social scientist. She's actually a social worker, but a PhD in that area. A couple other people.
Has an interesting thing on Netflix.
She's got a whole show now on Netflix.
Yeah, that's a 45 to 60 minutes show that is super interesting to watch.
Yeah. 2 other thought leaders that I studied that come into this space is one is David Rock. So he's a neuroscientist, and I've been through that. And I'm actually a brain-based coach. And so that's all about, how does your brain respond under threat? And that feeds right into psychological safety. And when you feel, that fight, flight, or freeze, and how do we respond there?
So the SCARF model is something that David Rock created, right?
Yeah, so SCARF is, status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. It's this acronym for those things that trigger us as people. So yes, Sohrab's quizzing me today. I love it. So those are some of the thought leaders. There's some other people, Adam Grant is another organizational psychologist. He talks a lot about thinking like a scientist, which helps us kind of have that growth mindset of inspect and adapt, and everything is a hypothesis, and more data is better as you continue to grow and learn. So those are the thought leaders. And what is the definition of psychological safety? I think that was your second question. There's a bunch of them, but I would say, to boil it down to 5 words, it's an environment of rewarded vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. An environment of rewarded vulnerability.
Right.
Okay, that's good. Okay, now let's go into this. So there's already been a few questions out there, but there's also one that I had on my list. Now, we talked about this overall concept. We learned about people that we can look at and research and read their books, watch their videos, etc. You have worked in several organizations yourself as an executive, as a leader. You've been coaching people in various organizations over the past years. What are a few of the initial steps that you recommend leaders to take within their organization or even within a team in order to create this environment where people can be vulnerable and feel safe?
Yeah. So one thing I guess I would ask, if people have a piece of paper, this is kind of a cool little thing, but write a flow chart, and at the top of the flow chart, write threat detection. And what is that? And it's like, we are constantly in this mode of assessing whether we're safe or not safe, whether you know it or not, right? Like, you show up at this meeting today, and if Sohrab and I were yelling at people and something like that, right away, you'd be like, wow, this is kind of not safe. It's kind of an awkward thing. I'm triggered a little bit, and that's probably a bad example, but you get the idea. You do it when you get on the phone with somebody, you do it when you walk into a meeting, you do it when you walk into a place to eat. You know, if the waiter or waitress like comes up and greets you warmly, you're like, oh, this is great. I feel open, I feel safe, kind of. If they walk up and they're sort of short and not very friendly to you and tell you to, you know, get outside and whatever, you know, it's like, you know, it's just an uncomfortable space. And so why I'm sharing this is because this is what vulnerability is. Since we said the definition is, you know, an environment of rewarded vulnerability. So vulnerability is the key, right? It's like, what is vulnerability? And for me, vulnerability is, you know, it's innovation and creativity. You show up and you're like, hey, if I feel open and safe, I'm going to be my best self and bring that to work. It's the birthplace for love and joy and creativity, all those things that people need when you feel safe. But when you don't, it's when you shrink back, right? It's when you're in that defensive sort of what I call red zone, when the tiger's like chasing you and you feel like personal risk management is the first thing you're going to think about. Self-preservation, you know, you shift from sort of this individual sort of creative mode to defensive performance mode. So if you think about a flow chart and you think about threat detection, if you go down one side and it says safe, and you're like, I'm open and I'm welcomed to be who I am. If you go down the other side and it's defensive and it's sort of this red zone, and you're like, now I'm into this like self-preservation, fight, flight, freeze mode. This is key to the things that we can do as leaders. So if you think about that sort of little flow chart as we talk about this, what do we do to put people in sort of that open and safe zone? So that's the first thing, is like, how do we make it safe to show up and be who we are? Mm-hmm. So the first thing you can do is this is Tim Clark's model, so I'll give him credit, but we can add a whole bunch of other thought leaders into each one of these sort of stages. But the first stage is what we would call inclusiveness, right? So in order to make people feel safe, put them in kind of this blue zone, people need to feel included. People need to feel like they belong, that they are loved, that they are supported, that they are valued. And so at this inclusive state, anybody should be included if you're a human. If you're a person on this planet and you're not trying to hurt somebody else, you're important and you're valued. So one of the first things we can do at work or in any team or in any place, at your home, in your family, at your church, whatever you do, like, is to include people. And people think, well, okay, so how hard is that? Well, the thing of it is we don't do it enough, especially with the remote world that we're living in. And so to include people means to not be biased. And if you have a brain, you have a bias. And so things like social, physical, ethnics, gender, political, religion, education, different economic status, age, all of those things are things that are playing on the loop in our head. And they're all things that in some way, shape, or form, we maybe are unconsciously creating a bias around those things. And so we are excluding people. Mm-hmm. Think about it at work. If you always ask the same people to go to lunch, or you always, talk to a certain group of people and not another group of people, why is that? And one of the first things we can do to create inclusivity is to take a hard look at some of our own bias and say, I'll give you an example for me. One of the things I struggle with is guns. And I don't like guns, right? So there are people in my circle that love guns. And it doesn't mean that, they're running around with a gun pointed at people, but they feel very sort of entitled, and it's the American way to have a gun. So I have to watch how I think about that, right? Imagine if I was at work and there was somebody in one of my teams that really loved guns and had pictures of guns and stuff all over in their cube or whatever. And we're not at the office anymore, but imagine, it's like, would I subconsciously avoid them or exclude them, or maybe not give them as many opportunities as I could? So these are things that we can do as leaders. And because we have bias doesn't mean we're bad. It just means that we're human. And all I would suggest for starters is create inclusivity for everybody. And let's start with ourselves. And so, what can we do? What are some things we can do? We can look at our own stereotypes and our own bias. And those are some things we talked about. The other thing you can do is ask, invite, and share. What do I mean by that? Is that, we'll use Sohrab as an example. So ask means check in with him. He lives in Germany on the other side of the world. And when we get on the phone, if the first thing I do is just launch into the work, it's like, what about him? Let me share a cute little story. Like, we were on the phone the other day, and we were talking about basketball, because I played basketball in college, so I sort of get it, and he's into it too. And we were talking about a guy that plays on the Nets, and he has a big beard.
James Harden.
James Harden, right? And so before he had the beard, he had this. His face was very different. Anyway, the point of the matter is, we laughed because we both pulled up pictures of James Harden with the beard and without the beard, and fear the beard and all this. We sort of got a good chuckle out of it. But the point I'm making is that we're creating some connection, a little inclusivity. We laughed together, we were like, oh, that's funny.
We're still laughing now.
and then we got into our work, together. And that made all the difference. I'm speaking for myself, but I loved it. It was kind of fun. And actually later in the day, I still kind of chuckled about our conversation. So my point is, ask, like, engage, invite, if you get the opportunity, if you're going to, virtual coffee talks, or you're having, the virtual beer on the Zoom or whatever, invite everybody, encourage everybody to be part of that. And, and then share a little about yourself, right? So this ask, invite, and share. So teams that do this on an ongoing basis create this sort of what I call norm of inclusion. And then that becomes the culture of that team. Yeah, so that's the first step. Yeah.
This is really cool. So unconsciously, one thing that I do in every workshop that I run, once we break down the number of people into smaller groups so that they can engage a bit deeper in breakout rooms, the first thing I let them do is to create a team presentation. And as part of the team presentation, I give them the exercise to not only present themselves individually, but also identify at least 2 things they have in common. And it doesn't count that they're participating in this particular workshop. And if it is an in-house course, so for one company, it doesn't count that they're working at the same company. So they need to go beyond the obvious. And then they identify that they have like a love for Italy, or for traveling, or for a certain type of food, or for a certain activity, right? And all of that. And really, if you think about it, like this 2-minute, 3-minute exercise not only triggers conversations, it creates what you earlier mentioned, this inclusivity, one. And at a later point in time, if that team continues to work together over a longer period of time, they always have something to talk about. So you and I, for example, always know, oh, we can talk about the basketball game that just happened last night, right? And that's immediately something where you, again, reconnect. And that's very interesting, and it's a simple thing that leaders can do within their team. So if you haven't done this with your teams up to now, this is something you can immediately do tomorrow, right? Take 10 minutes, identify things that you have in common, and immediately things will change towards the better. So that's inclusivity. What's next?
Yeah, so once you feel included and valued as a human, innately we want to learn, right? This is sort of, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're above sort of the basic needs of love, care, food, clothing, that kind of thing. Now we're into like, hey, I want to learn. I want to grow. And so naturally, in a business or in a team, you have this desire to learn and grow. And so as you move into this space, people need to support you, right? Your team needs to be around the supportiveness of your growth and your learning. And it's a great opportunity, one, for others to mentor others, right? So if you're somebody that has a great skill within your team, you can encourage and help others to grow. And we need that. Think about children, right? Like, I'm a godparent to the 2 little boys across the street, and I'm not doing this now, but over the summer we were trying to teach one of the boys how to ride a bike. And so, you start off with these training wheels, right? And then eventually you hold on to the back of the seat, and then pretty soon you let go, and he goes on his own and he falls, but he gets back up, right? And then there's probably some crying and some of that. But eventually he's like doing this on his own, and he doesn't want me around at all. It's like, I don't need your help, which is great. And my point for giving you the example of the training wheels and holding onto the seat, it's like, as adults, like, we want the same thing. We're just bigger kids, right? We need some coaching, we need some guidance, we need some support early on, and then eventually we can kind of go on our own. And we as adults put all this pressure on ourselves to look cool and be right and not feel silly at work, right? So that's part of it. In this next step of sort of creating psychological safety in the learning mode, you've got to feel safe to be able to make some mistakes and provide some guidance and support. Because remember, we were talking about the brain and how the brain responds to threat. And so one of the most important things in this phase of psychological safety is, if for some reason you feel like you're in that, remember that flow chart, you're in that red state, you're in that fight, flight, or freeze, or somebody's making fun of you, or somebody's like got this competition. Oh, Sohrab's way smarter, way better than me. And pretty soon I'm like, ugh, of course he is. It's like this comparison thing creates this void. But what's happening in our brains now is this front part of our brain, the executive process, has now gone offline, because the amygdala, the oldest part, the part in the back that does all of the emotions and the fight, flight, and freeze, has got us in the red zone. So when you're in this mode and your front process has gone offline, your ability to actually learn is really impacted. So your ability to learn and reason and think, boom, has gone offline. So it's super important.
Yeah.
What's that?
And also to create.
Yes, exactly.
Right? So, because learning and just basically bringing back what you have already learned and doing stuff as usual, that doesn't even take that much safety, right? But coming up with completely original ideas, that's the place then where that safety is needed. Okay, so we have inclusiveness. Yeah. We have the part of support. Now, with regards to support as a leader, is it enough to just signal to people and say, hey, I'm here, whatever support you need, let me know? Or what kind of other tips and tricks do you have that people can take with themselves after today's session and try to create this environment of support or the environment where people actually feel supported?
Yeah. Well, so let's take an example. Let's pretend that I work for Sohrab and we're in a team meeting, and I want to learn something. I feel included now, so this is a step function, and I want to learn something, and I volunteer for something, and I ask him about it, and he says, that's a great idea, and I say, well, would you help me? And if he says, you know what, Karen, I don't know how to do that either, but we can learn that together. First of all, that's amazing. Like, can you imagine how much I will really, really enjoy working for him because of his humanness and his ability to say, I don't know either, but we can do that together. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. The other thing he could say is, I don't know, but Janet on my team knows. And so maybe Janet can help you and she can mentor and coach you along the way. So the idea is creating an environment of sort of collaboration and support and mentorship. And I brought up Adam Grant before, if some of you know, but he has a book called Think Again. And I'd love to talk about it because I think it's an important part of this encouragement thing in the learning part is everything is about sort of a hypothesis. And as you're learning, like you have this growth mindset of think like a scientist. And so you're helping encourage people to try, inspect, adapt. I mean, it's agility in spades, right? So it helps build confidence. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say empiricism, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So this is key. And back to my bike example, but the idea is like on the spectrum of coaching, you have this ask and you have this tell. And when you're first learning something, you're really in the tell mode, kind of almost like holding onto the bike seat and the training wheels. So you're giving a lot more guidance. But as you move through and you start to transfer what I'd call critical thinking, which is like creative and new and thinking on your own, then you start to like get out of the tell and more into the ask. So you're really providing support along the way. And you're asking things like, you know, what are you thinking about this now? Or how might we try that? Or what are your thoughts about why this happened or what have you? So you're really more on that asking spectrum and really helping people start to critically think as they learn on their own. So say, I don't know, ask for help, you know, provide guidance and support and mentorship in this learning phase.
Yeah. So from the Agile leadership course that you and I both run, there is this section about the catalyst leader. And we usually go through an interview of a person, right, from Bill Joyner's book, Leadership Agility. And then there's this one sentence that this leader says, and it's about, I might be wrong. So he or she, in that case, we don't know the gender, says that, all right, I want to do this and that, but I might be wrong. And I always teach the people that I work with, is like, just adding this few words, I might be wrong, creates the space for other people to get in and provide different perspectives, right? And it's very similar to what you said, right? Ending with a question or saying, I don't know. Similar to that, I might be wrong. So very few things, simple tweaks that you can do in terms of how you communicate with others to create this environment of support and this environment of learning, and also signaling that you are part of this process as well. So it's not like you know everything and you don't have to learn, but oh, you're also here to learn. You're also curious to hear other people's perspectives, because that will help you also as a leader make better decisions. So it's not only about them being able to make better decisions, also you will benefit from that. And I think that makes a big change. Yeah. Cool. So we have inclusiveness, we have support. What's next, Karen?
Yeah, so inclusiveness, learner safety, the next thing is contributors. So naturally, once you feel included and then you're learning, now you want to plus one things, right? So you've got this, you know, little bit of feeling safe, feeling comfortable, having some confidence. And so now you want to make a difference, right? Basic human needs is to make a difference and to use your skills and abilities to make a contribution. So at this phase in psychological safety, this is an idea is that you have to earn this, right? This isn't something that's owed to you. So let me give you an example, and I'll go back to my college days, but I played college basketball. And as a freshman in college, I didn't get into the game a lot, but I went to all the practices. Obviously, I practiced, you know, the right food, the workouts, the plays, shot free throws, all of that. But I didn't get in the game a whole bunch. But as a sophomore, I started to get tapped on the shoulder by the coach to get in the game. And the reason that happened is because I earned it, right? I was working hard in practices and I got the opportunities to get into the game and contribute. So now I'm not sitting on the bench, but I'm in the game contributing. It's the same at work, right? So we start to learn things and now we're like, hey, I want to change this process, or I see it a different way. I want to kind of like plus one it or add to it. So you got to earn this, right? And so what happens along the way in the earning is that the big picture for the team is really the idea of why are we doing this? and then assigning the sort of the what based on your sort of will. I'd call it your will and your skill. And as you have more will and more skill, you have this like path of performance, and you're growing, and it's kind of this cyclical relationship between skill and will. And so then you're at the delegate the how. So the big thing is, if I volunteer and I want to contribute and I see things differently, now I'm really transferring the ownership completely to me. The critical thinking and the outcome is now in my hands to be able to create and to contribute at that level. So the team is part of this too. And it doesn't mean that you're abandoned, that it means that sometimes if you think about this, include, learn, contribute, you could go back to the learn step, get more knowledge, more support, more mentorship, more guidance, then move up to contribution. And so it kind of goes back and forth. And so that's the next step in the model.
Mm-hmm. So let me understand this, because what I took away, inclusiveness and also learning, is something that a leader within a team, and especially within an organization, has to some extent create the space for, right? It's very difficult, given your own example, back when you were at HP, you wanted to fit in because nobody else created the environment so that you could be included for who you were, right, back then. So your only choice was to fit in. Now, I would expect a leader in today's day and age to create a different environment so that people don't feel the need to fit in, but feel included. Mm. Same with learning, right? Creating a safe space for people to embark on a learning journey so that they are willing to learn new stuff, become more cross-functional, all of that kind of stuff. Now, this third point, contribution, yes, as a leader, we can give people, for example, ownership around certain topics or encourage them to contribute, but ultimately they also have to contribute in order to take this journey to the next step. Am I understanding this correct?
That's right. It's an earned space, and it's natural, right? Once you're included and once you're learning, you want to contribute. So it's a normal human thing. But you don't just show up and say, hey, guess what? I know how to do everything, and therefore I should be doing this. It's like, no, you do have to kind of earn that. The team has to feel that you earned it. And so that's part of it.
Putting in the work. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
That you're doing the practice. Okay. So now we have these three steps: inclusiveness, learning, and then ultimately the opportunity to contribute. What's next?
So then we go to the top, which is challenger, and challenging the status quo. This is back to our definition of psychological safety, an environment of rewarded vulnerability. This is the most vulnerable, by far the most vulnerable stage, because now you're speaking up and you're challenging the status quo. So back to my example with Sohrab as my boss. We talked about from learning, where he's like, I don't know either, but I'll help you, or Janet can help you, and that kind of thing. Now we're at the top and the challenger space. Imagine we're in a room and he's had a process that he's had in place for 20 years and it's worked great. And it's kind of his baby, right? And now I say, Sohrab, I don't like that, and I can see it a different way. And I think we should really examine whatever, XYZ. He can respond in two ways, right? Well, more than that, but let's just, to make it simple, he could easily say, so Karen, this has worked for 20 years and you're always the person that brings up all the negative stuff, and that's not helpful. Or he could say, we'll put that on the parking lot and we'll talk about it later. Or he could say, you know what? That's a great point and I love it. So let's talk about your thoughts, and let's talk about how we might incorporate that. Maybe I could see it a different way, and I can learn how to inspect and adapt back to that sort of growth mindset. So he's adopted that think like a scientist. So at that level, that opportunity for vulnerability to be in that blue zone, for me to feel safe, and for me to be able to be like, bring my best self to work, that has to be a place where if we challenge the status quo, that it's welcomed. Because if it's not, I can tell you that I'm going right back to that fight, flight, or freeze mode, that red zone. So I could either, one, get defensive and get mad at him and push back, which isn't probably constructive. So that's my, fight. I could freeze. I could be like, fine, I'm just not going to say anything then anymore. Forget it. There's no point in talking. Or third, I can like get through the meeting, walk out into the hall. And the next thing I do is, I happen to know his team, look over at Janet and go, you know what, Janet, like that sucked. And now we're having the meeting behind the meeting in the hall about what just happened, which again is not constructive either, right? So we're at this like phase of the most vulnerable from challenging the status quo. So what do, right? How do you make that easier? So one of the key things you can do is what I would call define air cover. So at that level, we need air cover, and we need to be able to focus on the actual problem, intellectual friction around the problem, not social friction around the person. So I keep picking on Sohrab, but like the idea is, as the leader in that group, he has to have some humility, control of his ego, and a capacity to be able to handle dissent. And I need to not say things that focus on him as the man, the person, but instead focus on
the problem,
the intellectual problem in the middle of the table. The issue at hand is about how do we make it better for our company, not how do I point out that he's incompetent as a person. So, but that's hard, right? These are hard things. And so one of the things I would suggest or recommend as leaders that you could take away from this conversation is to create like a working agreement that actually has in the process like loyal opposition or devil's advocate or we take this from Salesforce, something called the V2 MOM, right? Vision, values, methods, obstacles, and measures. And I highlight obstacles because what it does is it says, hey, what are the things in this process that might get in the way, that might be problems that we could overcome? So the process itself takes away some of that scariness of me having to be the person by myself speaking up against my boss or what have you, the status quo. And so the process takes some of that away. And the working agreements like could really define like, how do we create an environment where it's okay, and how would we stop and say, whoop, time out, maybe we need to take a break. We're focusing too much on the social component and not the intellectual component. Yeah. So at the challenger level, defining really how does the team interact and what is air cover so that we can challenge the status quo in a way that feels sort of more safe instead of more unsafe.
Yeah. What I find interesting now, so have working agreements that invite disagreement.
Correct. Yeah.
And then help us basically deal with that disagreement as well, right? What kind of conversation culture do we want to have in order to be able to talk about the difficult things without offending each other personally? Because then it will become extremely difficult and probably we won't solve that. The other thing that I take away is, and maybe I misunderstood, but that was like what I took away is, as a leader, and I always go back to this because a lot of the contexts where I deal with people, it's some people that are in specific leadership positions and others that are part of the teams, etc. And the leaders always ask me, like, what can I do? So as a leader, it's again about creating this space where people are invited to disagree with you or disagree with something that's in place, challenging the status quo. On the other hand, what I took away is the person who challenges the status quo now also needs to have the awareness how they do that while still keeping it a safe place for anybody who has been in charge of the status quo. Right. Because the moment you basically phrase your disagreement in a way that makes those people again defensive, you're not contributing to this being a safe environment for everyone, that we can focus on the problem on the table and make meaningful steps forward. So that was insightful for me. So we have these 4 steps. Is there anything else in Tim Clark's model, right? That's the one that you just walked us through.
That's right. Yeah. No, I mean, that's the thing. And inclusivity is probably the most important. And if you get to Challenger and you feel excluded, you can end up all the way back down at inclusivity. I think the thing I would sort of summarize it all with is it's like a lifestyle, right? You know, it's like a diet and exercise. Like, we cannot run a marathon on Sunday and go out on Saturday and run 20 miles and think, okay, I got this, right? It's like, this is an ongoing thing that you have to do every day to create psychological safety in your teams. But I truly think, back to the beginning of our dialogue, like, this is the thing in my retrospective of business and my career, is that this is the most important thing to make teams effective.
Yeah. So anybody who wants to dive deeper into this, Karen just walked us through one of the models. There are a few other things out there, plus even this model, you can go much, much deeper. There is a course that you offer, and I think it starts in April. And we will link it in the show notes of this video as the recording, and everyone who is participating in this live, we can also share that information with you. And I think one of my colleagues already shared it in the meetup group. Now, given the time, there's one more topic that I would quickly explore with you. Is almost 20 years ago, you wrote your PhD thesis. And you know I would bring this up. So you wrote your PhD thesis around the topic of remote work, right? 20 years before we went into this pandemic and everyone basically goes into working remote. What were the key insights of your thesis back then? And to what extent did you now, 20 years later, we're like, oh man, I was so right or I was so wrong on some of those key insights?
Oh, that's like funny. Yeah, 20 years ago, the doctoral dissertation I worked on was the productivity of remote teams, and from the perspective of the office worker and the remote worker and the manager of those folks. And I did it while I was at Hewlett Packard. So thanks to them for all their help. But basically, I created a model that said, what are the things that enable and what are the things that inhibit the productivity of these teams as these 3 populations? And let me just quickly summarize. So the things that enable productivity of these teams are management by objectives, good working technology, both software and hardware, work-life balance, and we'll talk about that because it ends up in both the enabler and the inhibitor, training for the environment, so really understanding the tools and things that you need, support, so people in organizations that actually support the folks that work remotely are really well versed in helping people work remotely, and then job type. So these are the sort of the things that enable. The things that get inhibited are teamwork, technology goes both ways, work-life balance goes both ways, and job type. So what does that mean? Like, at the end of the day, being clear about what it is that you're working on, so management by objectives, giving people autonomy is super important. But because people are home and isolated, the check-ins and the connection that we talked about, even in inclusion, was a core part of the learning. And then the other thing that I'll bring up that's sort of the aha for today, and it's obvious, is this concept of work-life balance. And that came up as people at home don't have these sort of bookends of I drove to work, or I'm at work to start work, or I drove home or I took the train and I'm home and now I'm home with my family, or vice versa. Like, when you're at home, and we all know this now, like, everything's all mixed up. Like, I'm in a room in my house, or I'm in the kitchen, or it depends. And so this concept of work-life balance is really a true thing that's coming to life today. And so there's a number of different other things I could go into, but like some of the future research I really suggested was look at that from a female and a male perspective. And now that's a big thing. If you're the female that takes care of the kids and the house and you've done that as a norm, and now you're at home trying to do that, like, how does that work? And, you know, is there burnout involved? The other big sort of aha that's now come to life is really cultural. And that was in the kind of the end of the research was, you know, how does this work culturally? People in Japan and people in, you know, countries, Asian countries that are there's a little more of the hierarchy maybe. How does that influence the way we work and the way we manage and so forth? So those are some of the key takeaways, is that what I learned 20 years ago is things enable and things inhibit. And today, the things that we're seeing come to play are really the same. It's just now it's not sort of optional. Like when I wrote this, it was like kind of not as much prevalent.
New thing,
now it's true. Yeah. So it's funny, I was kind of rereading it last night because I knew you might ask me this question, but I laughed out loud because I thought, geez, why didn't I write a book about this 20 years ago? But I didn't, but I still have the dissertation. It's 385 pages. So
yeah, it would be a bestseller today.
yeah. Well, I think everybody kind of knows it now. Like everything we discovered back then, I think it's truly come to fruition today.
Yeah, I think you'd be surprised. I mean, you mentioned everyone should have good access to technology. There's still so many clients that we work with where they don't have proper computers with cameras and microphones and all of that. And that, of course, makes working remotely very difficult. Yeah. So, Karen, with regards to time, thank you so much for waking up this early with your strong coffee. I didn't give you much time to drink the coffee because you were doing most of the talking.
I know, sorry, I think I talked too much.
Based on the questions that I just threw at you. But as always, it was a pleasure hosting you and diving deeper into this topic. And I'm sure we will talk about this at some point again. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Everyone, thank you so much for joining live. We hope this session was insightful to you and you took away some tangible things that you can do immediately, working with your teams to create this environment for, how do you call it? Rewarded vulnerability.
There you go. Yep.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.
Alrighty.